Hello and welcome to the Technology, Knowledge and Society Common Ground Conference for 2022. My name is Marcus Breen and I'm delighted to be able to offer a few words of introduction to the event. This is the 18th International Conference and it's been a remarkable and very productive ride over those many years, certainly since I attended the first conference at UC Berkeley. Nobody knew then that we'd be here in 2018. Sorry, what am I saying? At the 18th conference in 2022 under very different conditions. I want to make a few comments about the theme of the conference and draw your attention to some of the challenges that we have that really have escalated and won't go away for those of us who are especially focused on this development of technology, the dissemination of knowledge, the production of knowledge as a result of technology, and then the impact on society and the different options that there are, very much at the center of an increasingly intense debate around the world about what kind of society we have, how society is structured, what happens in society when technology is put to use. And of course, we're now quite familiar with these kinds of questions. We live in a highly technologized environment, and it almost doesn't matter where in the world we live. There are people who only 20 or so years ago didn't have a telephone. In fact, when I was working in Mexico in the year 2000, 30% of the population of Mexico had never made a telephone call. Now, the number of people in Mexico who own a telephone and who are full participants, if you like, in the dissemination of knowledge through that telephony amounts to about 99% or 98% of the population. That's barely 25 years. Incredible developments. So these things we need to pay attention to because they have brought about remarkable change. As to whether they're good or bad, that's something that we always need to keep in mind and to be part of the larger framework that we bring to these questions of this relationship, this nexus between technology, knowledge and society. The complexity of the current environment is unfolding before us. And I've submitted and put forward a letter that you can look at where I've listed some of these things, including, of course, a conflagration in the Ukraine, between the Ukraine and Russia. There is a remarkable realignment of global forces taking place that are putting pressure on all sorts of established arrangements geopolitically. Technology is very clearly involved in the campaigns for various interests to bring the public along according to whichever side you might be aligned with. There is certainly a dominant US Western set of interests, but then there's a very, very large number of other interests that we need to pay attention to as well. Technology helps us to be aware of this, but it also is worth keeping in mind how far we've come. I put behind me an old, somewhat water damaged photograph, print, and it's called Pastoral Symphony. And one of the reasons I like that is because, and the reason I bought it is because, firstly, it didn't cost very much because it's badly water damaged, but secondly, it reminds me of something that we might like to reflect on, that is the simplicity of a way of life where, a sort of romance, if you like, an ideal type of life without the challenges of technology and the pressures of geopolitical politics and so on. That's not the world we inhabit, although it might be a world we'd like to think of, even in a utopianistic sense. And of course, there's very, very much literature, has been for many years now, on questions of how we get to utopia and what sort of dystopia we might have to go through before we get there. So that's one aspect of the technology, knowledge and society consideration we're in. Of course, the other ones are are those things that we have around us that we're struggling to come to terms with and, if you like, simply comprehend as well as interpret. For example, also on my desk here is this wonderful book by Laura Mulvey, a theoretical book about the way we can now watch cinema, the way we do watch cinema, in fact, but also the questions that emerge from an observation of psychoanalysis and Freudian and psychoanalytic theory promulgated by Jacques Lacan. The idea that we can now stop videos, the idea that what you're watching now and what's here is due to the fact that the changes in video and the changes in visual communication are dramatically different to what they were many years ago. That I can record this in my study in my home here in Massachusetts, send it to Common Ground folk in Illinois, and then it can be distributed around the world is quite extraordinary. And if you want, you can stop and you can stop me talking anytime you like. You can switch it off. You can switch it on. You can probably make it go faster and so on. Remarkable capacity. Now, also on my desk is something that takes me back a lot further, right? And this is this fascinating study, right? Relevant perhaps to our presence in China for this conference. And that's this one, Discourse on the National Theology of the Chinese by Wilhelm Leibniz, a very well-known philosopher, European philosopher, who was a polymath and who spent some time exploring, just before he died in the 18th century, exploring the development and the emergence of Confucian and other forms of Chinese philosophy. And the curiosity here is, for me at least, is that the resources that he used were those written in Italian and Latin by Jesuit priests who'd gone to China to engage in an understanding of what was happening in China and to understand Chinese philosophy. Again, the sorts of things we often have on our desks are indicative of the challenges we face. I want to talk briefly now, just for a couple of minutes, about the theme of the conference, trust, surveillance, and democracy. I think it's important to say that one of the main features of any conference is that it proposes an open space for discourse, and that discourse, or discursive space, if you like, is based on trust between each of us as we, as participants and observers, watch and listen to each other and seek to learn and understand what they're doing. We try to do as best we can to make sense of each other's point of view. And we won't always have a consensus, and that's very important. And Common Ground has gone a long way to creating an environment where we trust each other, that is, the people in the organisation trust each other, and conference delegates trust each other. And the current conjuncture in the world, of course, is one where we're encouraged not to trust each other. And of course, the very nature of capitalism itself, the dominant ideological system under which most of us live, tends to encourage us to be strong individuals and look after ourselves and not trust other people. And I would like to suggest that we could step back from that and think about how we as researchers, academics, and members of the public can work at trusting each other, even when we may have significant differences of opinion. The second aspect of the conference is surveillance, and this is really ramped up, hasn't it, with the emergence of technology. There is really nowhere safe to hide, and it wasn't that long ago that the former head of the FBI, who was actually sacked unceremoniously by President Trump, said at a conference at Boston College that there is no such thing as complete privacy anymore, that surveillance is so comprehensive that we just have to acknowledge it and admit it. Now, it doesn't mean we're defeated by these claims, by James Comey, by the way, who was the head of the FBI when he said it, but we have to recognize that we are in a surveillance society. And if we had any doubts, particularly for those of us in the United States, there's always this book, another book on my desk, and this is by Edward Snowden, of course, Permanent Record. And if you want to really have something that'll curl your toes about surveillance and what's called the surveillance society or surveillance capitalism, look at Edward Snowden's account, a memoir of what happened when he was undertaking work as a consultant for the United States government. Very disturbing stuff, but that's the environment we now live in. How do we address this? And by the way, it's very important as well to keep in mind that the way we address surveillance will be largely defined by some of the cultural conditions and cultural assumptions that apply in the countries in which we live. Different people, different cultures have different attitudes towards privacy and surveillance. So let's keep that in mind. Similarly, the final theme, democracy. What is democracy? How is it displayed? How is it deployed? How is it defined? And how does it work out? This is very different in different countries. And there has been, unfortunately, an assumption that democracy just looks like whatever the United States decides. That is really deeply contestable. And this needs to be part of our ongoing conversation within the research community, but also to think about how technology challenges and makes possible different forms of democracy, different approaches to the management and organisation of society. So that's a few words of comment, introduction, potentially controversy. I hope that they help to launch us into a successful and productive event. And I want to say thanks to Common Ground for organising it, and certainly thank the National Chung Wai University of Education for their commitment to putting this on and to making it possible. So thanks, and onward and upward with this conference.